For more, let's talk to our correspondent in the United States, Kethevane Gorjestani. Kethevane, first of all, this trial getting underway today, what strategy should we expect from both the defence and the prosecution when they make their opening statements?
Well, the focus is definitely going to be on the cause of death, because that will determine very likely the outcome of this trial. Now, the prosecution is obviously going to try to make the case that Derek Chauvin was directly the cause of the death of George Floyd. They're going to focus on that video that was seen around the world of the former police officer kneeling on the neck of George Floyd for nearly 8 minutes. They're going to point out that the officer kept his knee on George Floyd's neck even after George Floyd was unresponsive. They're also going to use the medical examiner's report, a report that states that this was a homicide and the cardiopulmonary arrest was a result of that restraint, of that neck compression. Now, all they need to prove is that Derek Chauvin, was a substantial factor in the death of George Floyd, not that he was the sole cause of death. And that is important because the defense, of course, is going to try to prove that the former officer was not responsible for the death of George Floyd. They just need to sow a little bit of doubt in the mind of some of the jurors in order to make their case. And they're going to also use the medical examiner's report, a report that does rule it a homicide, but also mentions the presence of drugs in George Floyd's system, and also mentions several underlying health conditions that could have contributed to the death of George Floyd.
Kethevane, we remember, of course, those protests that rippled around the world after the death of George Floyd. Now, as this trial gets underway this week, what do you expect the impact of the trial itself to be on racial justice protests around the world?
Well, here in the United States, this trial is viewed really as a historic trial. And a lot of people, the people I spoke to during the protests in the summer in several U.S. cities, but also the people I spoke to in Minneapolis just a couple of weeks ago before that jury selection started. And everyone pretty much had the same idea about what this trial could bring. They had high hopes, but pretty low expectations. High hopes, of course, because they feel that there is something different this time around. They felt that when George Floyd died, with the spread of those racial justice protests across the U.S. and around the world, they felt that maybe something had changed in the country because of George Floyd's death. Low expectations because people in the U.S. also know that it is very, very hard to prosecute a police officer, let alone to convict a police officer, especially of murder. Derek Chauvin facing 2 murder charges in this case. To give you an idea of how difficult it is, in the past 15 years, several tallies put the number of conviction of police officers in fatal shootings in the United States at around 40 convictions. Most of those are actually lesser charges. Only 5 police officers have been convicted of murder in the U.S. in the past 15 years.
Kethevane Gorjestani for us there in Washington. Thank you very much.